Picture this. A quiet gas station, a soldier just back from deployment, and a gang of bikers looking for trouble. What happens next will leave you on the edge of your seat. This isn't just a story about conflict. It's about honor, discipline, and the quiet strength of a true warrior. Stay with us until the end to see how one man's training and courage turn the tables in the most unexpected way. If you love gripping stories of resilience and justice, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an epic tale like this. The sun hung low over the rolling hills of rural Tennessee, casting long golden streaks across the quiet highway. Captain Ethan Hayes, a combat medic, gripped the wheel of his dark green Chevy Silverado as it rumbled down the nearly deserted road leading to Miller's fuel stop. The small, weathered gas station sat just outside the town of Summit Creek, its faded neon sign flickering in the early evening light. While their service had returned to normal, he thought of what Ethan's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was anything but. 18 months in Syria had changed him. The war clung to him in ways he couldn't shake, settling into the creases of his uniform and the lines of his face. Though he was eager to get home and surprise his wife Laura and their 8-year-old son Noah, something about crossing that threshold felt unfamiliar, like stepping onto uncertain ground after months of sand and chaos. He reached into the center console and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Noah's drawing, a simple sketch of their family standing outside their house, drawn in bright crayon strokes, with the words, "Come home soon, Daddy." Ethan traced the worn edges, feeling a lump form in his throat. The little piece of innocence had traveled across continents with him, surviving explosions, sandstorms, and sleepless nights. Now he was finally back, but was he the same man his family had been waiting for? Ethan sighed, shoving the drawing carefully back into his wallet before pulling into the gas station. The gravel crunched under his tires as he rolled up to pump number 3. Stepping out, he stretched his tall, lean frame, the stiffness from the long flight and drive weighing heavily on him. His military fatigues, still crisp and clean, felt oddly out of place in the quiet setting. The warm Tennessee air wrapped around him, carrying the familiar scent of fried food from the diner next door, mingling with gasoline and pine trees. The distant sound of country music drifted from an old radio perched outside the store, and the soft chirping of crickets filled the evening air. Ethan glanced around, instinctively scanning his surroundings. Years of combat training had left him hyper-aware. Spotting the security cameras above the store entrance, noting the blind spots near the ice machine, and tracking the movement of the elderly clerk inside, flipping through an old newspaper behind the counter. Even here, in a place that should have felt safe, his mind couldn't help but assess threats and escape routes. Focus, he told himself. He inserted his credit card into the pump and let the fuel flow, watching the numbers climb on the digital display. His mind drifted to the surprise he had planned for Laura and Noah. Laura would probably cry, just like she always did during their reunions, and Noah, he could almost hear his son's laughter, feel the way he'd launch himself into his arms. Ethan had missed too many birthdays, too many firsts. He hoped the teddy bear stuffed in his duffel bag, wearing a miniature army uniform, would make up for it. He checked his watch. 7:45 p.m. If he drove straight through, he could be home by 9:30. Laura would be putting Noah to bed around then, but he knew his little boy had a habit of convincing his mom to stay up for one more story. Ethan smiled faintly at the thought. But just as he was screwing the gas cap back on, the distant rumble of motorcycles echoed through the fading light. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the air like a low, menacing growl. Ethan's jaw tightened as his combat instincts kicked in, his heart rate spiking ever so slightly. 3 motorcycles appeared on the highway, their headlights cutting through the dusky evening. The bikes slowed as they approached, the riders clad in worn leather vests adorned with patches that were too far away to read. They turned into the station, pulling up in an arrogant row near the store entrance. The machines hissed and groaned as they shut down, their chrome gleaming under the station lights. Ethan stole a glance at them without turning his head, his posture relaxed but his mind alert. The leader, a hulking man with a thick, scraggly beard and a deep scar running across his jaw, removed his helmet with a deliberate slowness. His vest bore the emblem of the Iron Reapers, a gang Ethan had heard about in passing. Known troublemakers with a reputation for intimidation. Stay calm. Just get your supplies and leave, Ethan reminded himself. Because if they do, you represent your loyalties, he thought to himself. As he watched the bikers dismount, the atmosphere around the gas station seemed to shift. The quiet evening no longer felt so peaceful. Ethan felt their eyes on him, lingering a little too long on his uniform. He could sense it, the slow building tension, the unmistakable feeling that trouble had just arrived. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the store, his boots hitting the pavement with a steady rhythm. He could feel their gaze following him, waiting, watching. Inside, the store felt like a sanctuary from the growing tension outside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air conditioning offered a brief reprieve from the humidity. The clerk, old man Travis, barely glanced up from his newspaper, but offered a nod of recognition. Ethan grabbed a couple of water bottles and some coffee for the drive. He felt the weight of his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a silent reminder of the life he was leaving behind and the new one waiting for him at home. As he stepped back outside, the bikers were still there, leaning against their bikes, watching him with expressions that bordered on amusement and something darker. The leader, Jace Grizzly, Porter, grinned at him, eyes gleaming with something that sent a ripple of unease through Ethan's gut. "Well, look at what we got here, boys," Jace drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "A real-life war hero." Ethan didn't respond, keeping his focus on his truck, but his pulse quickened. He had seen enough men like Jace in his time, bullies who thrived on intimidation. Jace took a slow step forward, flanked by his crew. "What's the matter, soldier boy? Too good to say hello?" Ethan stopped at the driver's door, forcing himself to stay calm. "Just passing through," he said evenly, keeping his tone neutral. The other bikers chuckled, a low menacing sound that echoed in the quiet lot. Ethan could feel the situation shifting from curiosity to something more dangerous. One of them, a wiry man with a shaved head and dark eyes, took a step closer. "You military types think you're better than us?" he sneered. "How was the Matrix Club?" Ethan remained silent, his jaw tightening. He could hear his heart beat in his ears, but his face remained an unreadable mask. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. Calmer, quieter. "Let it go, Jace." Ethan's eyes flicked to the biker standing slightly apart from the others. Tyler Ghost Evans. There was something familiar in his posture, a hesitation that didn't match the rest of the group. Ethan recognized it instantly. Ghost was one of them, but he wasn't fully committed to their cause. Jace scoffed but didn't push further. Yet. Ethan knew better than to think the encounter was over. He climbed into his truck, the engine roaring to life, but as he pulled out onto the highway, he caught a glimpse of Jace's reflection in the mirror. The war wasn't over. Not yet. As Ethan pulled out of the gas station, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The low rumble of motorcycles echoed behind him, vibrating through the humid Tennessee night like an unwelcome shadow. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, where the gleaming headlights of the Iron Reapers glared back at him like predatory eyes in the dark. His military instincts screamed at him to stay alert, but outwardly, he forced himself to remain composed. The quiet town of Summit Creek lay just a few miles ahead, but the empty stretch of highway between here and home suddenly felt far longer. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing the tension from his shoulders. He had faced worse, far worse, but something about this felt different. This wasn't a war zone, yet the anticipation of conflict coiled inside him like a spring ready to snap. The leader of the gang, Jace Grizzly Porter, rode at the front, his massive frame hunched over the handlebars of his black and chrome Harley. The scar running down his jaw gave him an even more menacing look under the dim glow of his headlight. His crew rode close behind, flanking him like wolves in formation. Their leather vests bore the worn insignia of the Iron Reapers. A skeletal figure gripping a scythe, a crude symbol of dominance and intimidation. Ethan recognized the way they moved, the way they positioned themselves strategically behind him. "They're testing me," Ethan thought, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. He glanced at his dashboard clock. 2 p.m. If he maintained speed, he'd be home in under an hour, but he knew better than to rush. Showing fear was the worst possible response. Years of training and experience told him that bullies like Jace fed on weakness, and any sign of hesitation would only embolden them further. The flickering lights of a roadside diner appeared up ahead, its small neon sign casting a weak glow onto the pavement. Ethan considered pulling in, but something in his gut told him it wouldn't make a difference. They would follow him no matter what. He pressed on, the Silverado's engine humming steadily, but his thoughts drifted back to the faces he left behind in Syria. His fellow soldiers who wouldn't be making this same journey home. His jaw tightened as a familiar pang of guilt twisted in his chest. The names and faces haunted him like ghosts, blending into the roar of the bikes behind him. He reached down, fingers grazing his wallet, feeling the worn edges of Noah's crayon drawing tucked safely inside. Focus, Ethan. Get home. As he approached the highway turnoff leading into Summit Creek, Ethan noticed something unsettling. The bikers were closing in. He stood and reached for his backpack, turning on its flap and focusing. The dull roar of their engines grew louder, and in his side mirror he saw Jace's smirking reflection. The man raised a hand, signaling something to his crew, and Ethan knew this was about to escalate. Suddenly, the bikers accelerated, flanking his truck on either side. Spike, the wiry, tattooed member of the gang, rode dangerously close to Ethan's passenger side, his leather-clad arm resting casually against the Silverado's side mirror. "Hey, soldier boy," Spike called over the roar of his engine. "Why you in such a hurry? Ain't you supposed to be out there saving the world?" His grin was sharp, his teeth yellowed from years of cigarettes and cheap liquor. Ethan ignored him, eyes forward, but his pulse quickened. His knuckles whitened on the wheel. He could feel Jace watching from the left side, keeping pace effortlessly. Jace's gravelly voice cut through the night air. "We just want to talk, hero," he sneered. "Ain't no need to get all nervous." Ethan gritted his teeth, keeping his response measured. "I've got nothing to say to you." Jace chuckled darkly. "Now that ain't friendly, is it?" He revved his engine louder. "Come on, soldier boy, don't be shy. We just want to know what it's like to be Uncle Sam's little puppet." The insult burned, but Ethan remained silent. He'd learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. His training had drilled into him the importance of composure, of not giving in to provocation. He focused on the road ahead, heart hammering in his chest, but his expression betrayed nothing. Jace didn't like being ignored. "You deaf or just stupid?" He swerved closer, the rumble of his bike shaking the truck. "We're talking to you, soldier." Ethan's grip tightened, his jaw set. He glanced briefly at the other rider. Tyler "Ghost" Evans. Unlike the others, Ghost wasn't taunting him. He rode slightly behind, his posture tense, his face set in a mask of uncertainty. Ethan recognized that look, a man caught between two worlds. He doesn't belong here, Ethan thought. Spike, however, wasn't done. He reached out, smacking the side of Ethan's truck with an open palm. The sharp crack echoed through the night. "Oops," he laughed. "Slippery roads, huh?" Ethan took a deep breath, counting to 10 in his head. It was a tactic he used overseas when tempers flared and patience wore thin. But these weren't insurgents. These were homegrown troublemakers, and he couldn't respond the way he would have in a combat zone. The Silverado's headlights caught the green sign for Summit Creek's town limits. Almost there, Ethan thought. But he knew this wouldn't end here. They wanted to rattle him, to push him until he snapped. And if there was one thing he wouldn't do, it was give them the satisfaction. Without warning, Jace accelerated, cutting in front of the truck, forcing Ethan to tap the brakes to avoid a collision. He cursed under his breath, his patience wearing thin. "Back off," Ethan said firmly, his voice carrying through the open window. Jace laughed, raising both hands in mock surrender. "We're just having a little fun, hero." Ethan's eyes flickered to Ghost again, catching the tension in his posture. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't joining in. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said quietly, locking eyes with Ghost for a split second. Ghost's jaw tightened. but he said nothing. The gas station was now a speck in the distance, but the weight of the encounter was far from over. Ethan knew he had to end this, but carefully. "Last warning," he said, his voice like steel. "Get lost." Jace leaned in, his voice a low growl. "Make me." In that moment, Ethan realized Jace wasn't just trying to intimidate him, he was testing him, waiting for a reaction. And Ethan had no intention of giving him one. Without breaking eye contact, Ethan tapped his brakes hard, forcing Jace to swerve to avoid rear-ending him. It was a calculated move, just enough to assert dominance, without crossing the line. Jace's grin faltered for a moment before he laughed again. But it wasn't as confident as before. "All right, soldier boy," he sneered, falling back. "We'll see you around." The gang roared past him, disappearing into the night like phantoms, their laughter fading into the distance. Ethan exhaled, the tension in his chest slowly easing. He rolled his shoulders, releasing the grip he hadn't realized he'd been holding on the wheel. But as his truck rumbled into Summit Creek, the small-town lights welcoming him home, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was only the beginning. He parked in front of his house, staring at the porch light glowing in the darkness. Laura and Noah were inside, safe. But for how long? His fingers found the crayon drawing in his wallet once more, and as he traced the familiar lines, he whispered under his breath, "I'm home." But deep down, he wasn't sure if it would stay that way. Ethan sat behind the wheel of his Silverado, parked just outside his house in Summit Creek, the glow of the porch light flickering in the distance. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion weighing heavily on him, but his mind remained sharp. The encounter with the Iron Reapers gnawed at his thoughts like an unshakable shadow. "They'll be back," he thought, staring out into the quiet neighborhood. No, Summit Creek was a small town, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played in the streets. But Jace and his gang didn't belong here, and Ethan knew they wouldn't let tonight go so easily. He wasn't just some passerby to them anymore. He climbed out of the truck, the cool night air doing little to ease the tension in his muscles. With each step toward the front door, he felt the weight of the evening pressing down on him. When the door swung open, Laura stood there, relief flooding her eyes. "You're late," she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. "Ran into some trouble," Ethan admitted, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Laura studied him, sensing the tension in his voice. "Ethan?" He forced a tired smile. "I'm fine, really." But they both knew he wasn't. The war had followed him home in ways neither of them had anticipated. The next day, Ethan found himself back at Miller's fuel stop, the events of the previous night playing over in his mind as he filled his truck's tank. He could feel eyes on him, his instincts sharper than ever. As he tightened the gas cap, the sound of heavy engines rumbled through the air. A knot of tension formed in his gut as he looked up to see them, the Iron Reapers, 5 of them this time, rolling in with an arrogance that made his blood boil. Jace led the way, his scarred face stretched into a grin that didn't quite reach his cold eyes. The others flanked him like wolves, circling Ethan's truck deliberately. Ethan remained still, keeping his expression neutral, but his senses were on high alert. Every muscle in his body coiled, ready to react if necessary. Well, Jace drawled, stepping off his bike with an air of false amusement. "Look who it is. Didn't think we'd see you so soon, soldier boy." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, focusing instead on his breathing. Jace took a step closer, invading his space with predatory ease. "You military types always think you're better than the rest of us. That uniform doesn't mean much around here, you know." The gang snickered behind him, the sound grating against Ethan's nerves. "I'm just here to get gas," Ethan said evenly, meeting Jace's gaze without flinching. Jace smirked. "Yeah, well, I think you owe us a little respect." He reached out and flicked the American flag patch on Ethan's uniform, his eyes daring him to react. "What's this really worth to you, soldier?" Ethan's breath slowed, and a flicker of something dangerous passed through his eyes. He could feel the pressure building, the urge to act, but he kept his voice steady. "Let go." The warning was clear, calm, and absolute, but Jace wasn't done. He yanked at the patch, the threads straining under the pressure. Ethan's mind flashed back to Syria, to a moment just like this. Dust swirling, tension thick, an enemy taunting him. Just before the first shot was fired, he exhaled sharply, pulling himself back to the present. "I said let go." The bikers laughed, but there was an undercurrent of unease now. Ethan took a slow step forward, his posture shifting from passive to authoritative. "You don't want this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Jace pause. And then, without raising his voice, Ethan added, "I've seen worse than you in places you can't imagine." The subtle change in tone silenced the gang's laughter. Even Jace faltered for a second, his fingers loosening their grip. For the first time, Ethan saw something flicker in the biker's eyes. Uncertainty. Behind them, Tyler, Ghost Evans, shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't joined in the taunts, instead standing slightly apart from the others. Ethan caught his eye, and for a brief second they shared an unspoken understanding. Ghost didn't want to be here. Jace, sensing his authority slipping, hardened his expression. "You think you're tough, huh?" His voice was rougher now, edged with frustration. "Well, let's see just how tough you are." Ethan saw it coming before it happened. Jace shoved him hard, a sucker move designed to provoke, but instead of reacting with anger, Ethan absorbed the hit, staying grounded, his eyes locked onto Jace's with a calm that unnerved the gang. "You done?" Ethan asked simply. Jace's lips curled in a sneer. "Not even close." He shoved again, and this time Ethan caught his wrist with lightning speed. The biker froze, eyes widening as Ethan's grip tightened. Firm, but controlled. "I've given you more chances than you deserve," Ethan said, his voice quiet but commanding. "Walk away." For a moment, the gas station was silent, the air thick with tension. Ethan could feel the weight of their stares, the test he was being put through. Ghost took a step forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Come on, Jace," he muttered. "We don't need this." Jace shot him a dark glare, but hesitated. Ethan, still holding Jace's wrist, released it slowly, making his point clear. But before the situation could de-escalate fully, Spike, eager to prove himself, knocked over a rack of chips inside the store, sending bags cascading to the floor. The elderly store clerk, Old Man Travis, who had been watching nervously, startled at the sudden commotion. His hand hovered near the phone. "That's enough," he barked, his voice stronger than expected. Ethan glanced at Travis, then back at the bikers. "You heard him," he said. "Leave." Jace lingered for a moment longer, his jaw tightening, but something about Ethan's unwavering stance finally got through to him. He grinned darkly, stepping back. "We'll see you around, soldier," Jace muttered, leading his gang toward their bikes. Ethan didn't respond, watching them mount their bikes and roar away down the highway, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and tension. He stood there for a moment, exhaling slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. Chase ended. Travis approached, his face lined with worry but also admiration. "Son," he said, handing Ethan a bottle of water. "I've seen a lot in my years, but the way you handled that took guts." Ethan took the water with a nod. "Thanks, Travis." "You be careful with those boys," the old man warned. "They don't take kindly to being embarrassed." Ethan nodded again, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know," he said simply. As he climbed into his truck, he spotted Ghost still standing by the pumps, watching him with an unreadable expression. Ethan gave him a brief nod, and after a moment of hesitation, Ghost returned it. Ethan drove away, the gas station fading into the rearview mirror, but he knew this wasn't over. Ghost hesitated, his gaze flickering between the two men. Ghost returned it. He looked at Cole. Ethan drove away, the gas station fading into the rearview mirror, but he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, and deep down, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel remained tight as he drove away from Miller's fuel stop, the distant hum of the Iron Reaper's motorcycles still echoing in his mind. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gang following him, but the road remained empty behind him. He exhaled slowly, releasing a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The encounter with Jace gnawed at him. The tension in his chest coiled like a loaded spring. He knew bullies like Jace. They wouldn't just let this go. He could feel it in his bones. The subtle warning from Ghost still echoed in his ears. "We don't need this." There was doubt in Ghost's voice, hesitation that Ethan couldn't ignore. The man wasn't fully committed to the gang's life, and Ethan recognized that look. Ghost had been a soldier once too. The town of Summit Creek came into view, its familiar sights and sounds offering some comfort. Street lights flickered on, casting a soft amber glow on the quiet roads. He turned down his street, his heart tugging at the sight of his home. Warm, inviting, untouched by the chaos he had just left behind. Laura stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly, worry evident in her posture. Ethan parked and stepped out, plastering on a reassuring smile, but she saw right through it. "They're not going to let this go, are they?" she asked quietly, searching his face for answers he couldn't give. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll handle it." Laura's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes filled with concern. "Ethan, you just got home. I can't do this again. I can't." Her voice broke and he stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her. "I know," he whispered, "but I won't let them come near you or Noah. I promise." As if on cue, the faint sound of distant engines reached their ears. Laura stiffened in his embrace, and Ethan turned toward the road, his jaw clenching. He could see the faint glow of headlights approaching, cutting through the dark. Ethan kissed Laura's forehead gently. "Go inside. Now." She hesitated, but the steel in his voice left no room for argument. She disappeared into the house, and Ethan took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the driveway, his eyes locked on the road. 3 motorcycles rolled to a stop just outside his property. Jace was in front, as expected, with Spike and Ghost flanking him. Jace swung off his bike with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. "Nice place you got here," Jace said, his voice filled with mock admiration. "Cozy? Family orcharded." His eyes flicked toward the house, and Ethan's blood boiled. "I told you to leave me alone," Ethan said, his voice low and measured. Jace smirked. "And I told you we weren't done." He stepped closer, his broad frame casting a shadow in the porch light. "You embarrass me, soldier boy. Can't have that." Ethan held his ground, his fist clenching at his sides. "You don't want this fight, Jace." Jace laughed, the sound thick with arrogance. "I think I do." Without warning, he threw a sucker punch aimed at Ethan's face. Ethan moved with the kind of reflexes honed by years in combat. He ducked under the punch effortlessly, stepping into Jace's space, and using his own momentum to twist his arm behind his back. Jace grunted in pain, struggling against the hold, but Ethan's grip was ironclad. "I warned you," Ethan growled into Jace's ear. "I'm not some barroom pushover." Spike lunged forward, but Ethan reacted instantly. He shoved Jace into him, sending both men stumbling back. Ghost, still straddling his bike, didn't move. He watched, his eyes darting between Ethan and his so-called brothers. Jace roared with anger, recovering quickly. He charged again, swinging wildly, but Ethan sidestepped him with precision, his training kicking in. He caught Jace's arm and drove an elbow into his ribcage with controlled force, sending the biker sprawling to the ground with a ground. Spike charged next, but Ethan was ready. He dodged the wild punch and swept his leg under Spike's feet, sending him crashing onto the driveway. The wind was knocked out of him, and he lay there groaning. Ghost dismounted his bike, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Jace, enough," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. Jace scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his face red with rage. "I ain't done with you yet, Hayes," he spat, wiping blood from his lip. Ethan's face remained unreadable, but his voice carried an undeniable warning. "Walk away, Jace, before you get hurt." The distant wail of sirens sliced through the night, growing louder. Jace cursed under his breath, throwing a venomous glare at Ethan. "This ain't over," he snarled. "You're right," Ethan replied coolly. "It's just getting started." The flashing lights of an approaching patrol car filled the driveway, and within seconds Deputy Rachel Barnes stepped out, her hand resting on her holstered gun. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Spike still on the ground, Jace nursing his arm, and Ethan standing tall, calm and collected. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Barnes turned to Jace with a look that could cut steel. "I warned you about causing trouble in my town, Porter," she said coldly. Jace held up his hands. "We were just having a little chat." Barnes narrowed her eyes. "Right. A chat that ended with you on the ground?" Ghost spoke up, his voice hesitant. "It got, out of hand." Barnes nodded slowly, chewing on the inside of her cheek. "Ethan, you pressing charges?" Ethan considered it for a moment, his eyes never leaving Jace's. "Not yet," he said finally. "But if they come back here, we'll have a different conversation." Barnes turned back to Jace. "You heard him. Leave. Now." Jace scowled but didn't argue. He motioned to Spike, who staggered to his feet, and with a final glare at Ethan, the bikers climbed onto their motorcycles and peeled out of the driveway, their tires spitting gravel as they sped away. Barnes sighed, turning to Ethan. "You okay?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah. Thanks for showing up." Barnes glanced at the house, where Laura peeked through the curtains. "You sure you can handle this, Ethan? Jace isn't the kind to back down." Ethan's expression hardened. "Neither am I." Barnes smirked. "Figured as much." She gave him a nod before heading back to her cruiser, leaving Ethan standing in the glow of the porch light, tension still thick in the air. Laura stepped outside, wrapping her arms around herself. "Ethan." "I know," he said softly, pulling her into his arms. "But it's over. For now," she whispered, resting her head against his chest. Inside, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his thoughts racing. He knew tonight was only a temporary victory. Jace would be back, and next time, he'd bring more than fists. Ethan reached into his wallet and pulled out Noah's crayon drawing again, staring at it for a long moment. This was why he had to stay strong, why he couldn't let men like Jace dictate his life. Noah's small footsteps padded into the room, his sleepy voice breaking the silence. "Daddy, are the bad guys gone?" Ethan smiled softly, tucking the drawing back into his wallet. "Yeah, buddy, they're gone." But as he tucked Noah into bed that night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling deep in his gut. This wasn't over. Not yet. Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after Laura had gone to bed, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. His hands were steady, but his mind was anything but. The night's confrontation with Jace and his gang replayed in his head over and over. The weight of Jace's sneer, the crack of his fist slicing through the air, the raw aggression in Spike's eyes. Ethan had handled it the only way he knew how, with precision, control, and discipline, but he knew better than to believe it was over. The soft click of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Laura standing in the doorway, wrapped in her robe, concern etched into her face. "You're not sleeping," she said softly. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Could say the same about you." Laura walked over, sitting beside him at the table. I keep thinking about what could have happened tonight." Her voice wavered, and Ethan could see the fear she was trying so hard to push down. "Noah was asleep upstairs, and you were out there, with those men." Ethan reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "It's over, Laura." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced out the kitchen window toward the street, half expecting to see the distant glow of headlights again. "I told the sheriff I wouldn't press charges," he admitted. "Thought it'd be best to let it go." Laura stared at him in disbelief. "Let it go?" "Ethan, those men showed up at our home. They threatened you. Her voice cracked and she shook her head. "What if they come back?" "They won't," Ethan said firmly, though a small voice in the back of his mind doubted it. Laura squeezed his hand tighter. "You don't know that." She paused, swallowing hard. "You're not at war anymore, Ethan. This isn't Syria. You don't have to handle everything alone." He looked at her, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. "I know," he said softly. But deep down, a part of him still felt like he had to. Just then, a sharp knock at the front door made them both freeze. Laura's eyes widened in alarm, but Ethan's expression turned to steel. He stood slowly, motioning for her to stay put as he moved toward the door. Through the peephole, he saw the familiar face of Deputy Rachel Barnes standing under the porch light, her notepad in hand. Ethan unlocked the door and stepped outside, closing it behind him. "Deputy," he greeted, keeping his voice neutral. Barnes nodded. "Ethan, thought I'd drop by, see how you're holding up." Her eyes scanned the quiet neighborhood. "I don't think those bikers are done with you yet." Ethan crossed his arms over his chest. "I figured." Barnes sighed, flipping through her notepad. "Look, I get it. You want to handle this yourself. But Jace Porter? He's not the type to back off easy. Guy's got a record longer than the state highway. You sure you don't want to press charges?" Ethan glanced back at the house, at the faint glow of the living room lamp where Laura sat waiting anxiously. "I want to keep my family out of this as much as possible," he said finally. "But if they come back, I won't hesitate." Barnes studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, just stay sharp, all right?" She hesitated before adding, "And Ethan, you did the right thing tonight, kept your cool. Not a lot of guys would've." Ethan offered a tight smile. "I didn't have much of a choice." Barnes tipped her hat and left, her patrol car disappearing down the street. Ethan lingered outside for a moment, breathing in the cool night air, before heading back inside. Laura was waiting for him, arms crossed. "What did she say?" "Same thing I already knew." He leaned against the doorframe, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "It's not over." The next morning, Ethan took Noah to school, keeping a careful eye on his surroundings the entire drive. His son, blissfully unaware of the tension lingering in his father's mind, chattered about his upcoming baseball game, his excitement contagious. "Will you come watch me play this time, Daddy?" Noah asked, his bright blue eyes full of hope. Ethan smiled, guilt gnawing at his gut. Wouldn't miss it for the world, buddy." As he watched his son run toward the school doors, backpack bouncing on his small shoulders, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was home now, this was his life, and he had to protect it at all costs. That afternoon, Ethan stopped by Miller's fuel stop for a cup of coffee, his gaze flicking to the place where the confrontation had happened. Inside, old man Travis greeted him with a nod and a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," Travis said, sliding the cup toward him. "You earned it." Ethan took the cup with a small smile. "Thanks, Travis." The old man leaned on the counter, his weathered face serious. "I saw what happened last night on the camera, son. You handled yourself real well. Better than I did back in Nam." Ethan sipped his coffee, feeling the old veteran's eyes on him. "Just did what I had to do." Travis nodded slowly. "That's what we all say, but you carry it with you, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The door chimed and Ethan instinctively tensed. But it wasn't the bikers. Instead, it was Tyler "Ghost" Evans, standing awkwardly at the entrance, looking out of place in his leather vest. Ethan eyed him warily but said nothing as Ghost approached the counter. "Travis, can I get a pack of smokes?" Ghost asked, his voice quieter than Ethan expected. Travis grunted and grabbed a pack from the shelf, sliding it across the counter. "Still riding with those boys?" he asked pointedly. Ghost hesitated, then shook his head. "Thinking about getting out." Ethan's interest piqued, but he didn't say anything. He just watched as Ghost paid and turned to leave. Just before walking out the door, he stopped and glanced back at Ethan. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I didn't sign up for all this crap. Jace, he's going too far." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time to make a choice." Ghost's eyes darkened with thought before he gave a small nod and disappeared out the door. Travis let out a low whistle. "That boy's in over his head." Ethan took another sip of his coffee, his mind working through what just happened. If Ghost was looking for a way out, maybe this whole situation could be diffused before it escalated further, or maybe it was already too late. Later that evening, Ethan sat on the couch flipping through channels mindlessly while Laura read beside him. The tension from the night before hadn't quite left him, but the quiet of home was soothing. Suddenly his phone buzzed, a text message. Unknown number. "You think this is over? It ain't." Ethan stared at the screen, his heart hammering. Laura leaned over, reading it, her face draining of color. As they were walking home, Laura suddenly felt a pulse from his hand. He glanced at it, and then he shut the phone off and set it aside. "It's nothing," he said, but they both knew it was a lie. As the night stretched on, Ethan sat in the dark, staring out the window at the empty street, his mind racing. He had been through hell and back overseas, but now the battle was right here at home, and he wasn't sure how it would end. The sun was setting over Summit Creek, casting a golden glow over the quiet town as Ethan sat on the back porch, watching Noah chase fireflies across the yard. The soft hum of crickets filled the air, blending with the distant murmur of a baseball game on the radio inside the house. The events of the past few weeks lingered in his mind, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe. They belonged to someone else, but they were his. He had a new wife now and family and a place to go. It had been a long road, both literally and figuratively, but tonight things finally felt different. Not perfect, but better. The Iron Reapers were no longer a looming threat. After the final confrontation at the gas station, Jace had been arrested, charged with outstanding warrants that had finally caught up to him. The rest of his gang scattered, their grip on the town broken. Ethan had pressed charges after all, ensuring that men like Jace wouldn't have the opportunity to torment anyone else. Deputy Barnes had kept him updated, and from what he'd heard, Jace wouldn't be seeing the outside world for a long time. Ethan glanced down at his hand, Noah's crayon drawing still tucked inside his wallet, worn and creased but intact. It reminded him why he fought so hard, not just in the military, but here at home, for Laura, for Noah, for the life he had fought to return to. The door creaked open behind him, and Laura stepped outside, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She handed him one, sitting beside him with a sigh. "You look like you're finally relaxing," she teased softly. Ethan chuckled, taking a sip. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "Took me long enough." Laura studied him for a moment, reaching out to trace a hand along his jawline. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, "for everything." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "Couldn't have done it without you." Laura smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "No more trouble, right?" Ethan's lips twitched into a smirk. "I'll do my best." Inside, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a message from Tyler Ghost Evans. "Thanks for everything. I'm getting out for good. Thought you should know." Ethan exhaled, staring at the screen for a long moment before replying. "You did the right thing. Stay safe." A sense of relief washed over him. Tyler had been stuck in a life he didn't belong in, but now he had a chance to turn things around. Ethan hoped the younger man would find his way, maybe even find some redemption, just like Ethan had after coming home. The next morning, Ethan found himself at the local VFW hall, a place he'd avoided for months after returning from deployment. The familiar scent of old coffee and tobacco lingered in the air, and the low murmur of conversation drifted through the room. He wasn't sure what had brought him here today. Maybe it was the need to reconnect, to find a sense of belonging outside the battlefield. Several older veterans sat around a table, swapping stories from their days in the service. One of them, Franklin, a retired Marine with silver hair and a weathered face, waved him over. "Heard about what happened at the gas station," Franklin said with a grin. "You did good, son. Real good." Ethan smiled, pulling up a chair. "Just doing what I had to do," Franklin chuckled. "Ain't that what we all say?" He took a sip of his coffee. "But listen, we've been talking. A lot of younger guys coming home could use someone like you around here. You got experience, the kind they can trust." Ethan hesitated. He'd spent so much time trying to put the military behind him. But maybe the answer wasn't to leave it behind entirely. Maybe it was about using what he'd learned to help others who were struggling the same way he had. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Franklin grinned. "That's all we ask." As the conversation shifted to old war stories and familiar laughs, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just a soldier returning from war anymore. He was a part of something bigger, something meaningful. Later that evening, back at home, Ethan and Noah sat on the living room floor, a fresh set of crayons spread out between them. Noah worked diligently, his tongue poking out in concentration as he drew another picture of their family, this time with Ethan standing proudly next to him, holding hands. "Looks perfect," Ethan said, ruffling his son's hair. Noah beamed. "You think so?" Ethan nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. Noah whispered to him, "It doesn't look the same. None of it looks the same." "Yeah, buddy, I do." He watched as Noah carefully folded the drawing and handed it to him. "Keep it with you, okay? So you won't forget us if you go away again." Ethan swallowed hard, pulling his son into his arms. "I'm not going anywhere, Noah. I promise." Laura stood in the doorway, watching them with a soft smile. Ethan met her gaze and saw the quiet strength that had carried them both through the darkest times. He was home now, truly home. A week later, Ethan stood outside the gas station with Travis, sharing a cup of coffee under the neon lights that had once felt so menacing. "Been quiet lately," Travis mused, stirring his coffee. "Guess you scared those boys straight," Ethan chuckled. "Let's hope it stays that way." Travis nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn patch, the American flag, similar to the one Jace had tried to rip off Ethan's uniform. He pressed it into Ethan's hand. "Had this since Nam," Travis said gruffly. "But I think you've earned it." Ethan stared at the patch, the weight of its meaning pressing deep into his chest. He clenched it in his fist, nodding. "Thank you, Travis. It means a lot." The old man patted his shoulder. "You remind me of the good ones, son." As Ethan drove home that night, he felt something shift inside him. The ghosts of war were still there, but they didn't haunt him as much as they used to. He had found his purpose, not just in protecting his family, but in being a part of his community, helping others who had walked the same path. When he pulled into the driveway, Noah's drawing sat on the dashboard, a constant reminder of what truly mattered. It was a promise he felt like he deserved more and didn't deserve. "I'm the one protecting them." He picked it up, running his fingers over the crayon lines, and smiled. Tonight he could finally allow himself to feel at peace. Because heroes weren't just made on the battlefield, they were made at home, in the quiet moments of resilience, in the unwavering love of a family, and in the strength to move forward. Ethan Hayes has been through an intense journey, facing off against the Iron Reapers, protecting his family, and confronting the lingering shadows of his past. His story is one of courage, resilience, and the struggle to find peace after war. But now the question remains, what should Ethan do next? Should he take a more aggressive stand against the lingering threat of Jace's gang? Or should he focus on rebuilding his life and reconnecting with his family? The choices ahead are not easy, and that's where we need your thoughts. Do you believe Ethan should lean on the support of the local VFW community, using his military experience to help younger veterans find their way? Or should he step away from the past completely and embrace civilian life without the burden of what he's been through? And what about Tyler Ghost Evans? Do you think he's truly out of the gang life, or could he still have unfinished business with Ethan? These questions are vital, and your perspective can help shape the next chapter of Ethan's journey. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Ethan should take the fight to Jace and his crew once and for all, or should he focus on finding inner peace and stability with his family? How can he balance his military instincts with the quiet life he longs for? And what role should his family play in his next steps? Your input matters, and we'd love to hear what you think. If you've enjoyed Ethan's journey so far, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on his story. Your support helps bring these gripping tales to life, and we're excited to hear where you think Ethan's path should lead next. Leave a comment below, and let's keep the conversation going.